Hello everyone, bringing you the Mannequin of the Month for April 2023 today. Before we get into the main topic of the video, I just want to apologise first of all. I do have a cold, which you may be able to hear in my voice. So if there's any choppy editing, that's probably because I've ended up coughing and had to go in and cut that bit and obviously edit the video back together. And I'm going to do my best to talk over it, but it probably will affect my voice a little bit. So my apologies for that. What we're looking at in this video is a recreation of the kit of a private in the 3rd Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment, serving in Korea in the winter, spring of 1951. And the topic that we're talking about here, this kit, was of course chosen via a poll over on Patreon. The corporal tier over there get the opportunity to vote each month on what's going to be covered, and this topped the poll this month. This is relatively similar, or similar in some regards, to the kit we looked at previously in Mannequin of the Month on the recreation of Canadian kit during the war. Quite apart from anything else, some of the web equipment is Canadian made, which was fairly common in Australian service at this time. We'll talk about that in more detail as we move this round and look at the various details. Starting at the top as we normally do, we have the ubiquitous Australian bush hat or schlep. Starting at the top as we normally do, we have here the ubiquitous Australian slouch or bush hat, and this is a relatively Starting at the top as we normally do, we have here the Australian slouch hat. This is a rather battered example which has had the puggaree removed, and it's fairly common to see in photographs at the time that the men of 3RAR removed the puggarees from their hats. It wasn't universal. You see lots of hats with puggarees as well. Just chosen to remove it in this instance to illustrate that point. They were sometimes removed from the hats, and that's quite common to see in photographs at the time. The basic uniform consists of the Australian service dress. You can see the collar of the service dress jacket here. And this is the later war pattern of Australian service dress, still worn in the 1950s. And over the top of that, we have a US M1943 combat jacket. Now, the US M1943 combat clothing was very ubiquitous in Korea at the time. It was used by many different forces, obviously British forces out there at the time. Many of the other international units, men from other countries who were deployed to Korea, ended up using this as well. And at this time, it was common to see with Australian troops, both worn on its own and worn over the Australian service dress as an extra layer. Obviously, the winters in Korea are very cold, can be extremely cold, so having this worn over the wool uniform actually makes for quite a good combination for cold weather. You can see here the 2 breast pockets, with 2 hip pockets as well, hidden by the pouches, concealed buttons down the front. The US M1943 combat uniform is an interesting uniform. It's something of a progenitor of other combat uniform seen around the world. The developments of combat uniform were influenced by this, and the British combat uniform introduced in Korea, of course, drew inspiration from this. The design originating pre-Korean War, and it was actually introduced for use in Korea initially, and the inspiration behind it at least was the US combat uniform. The web equipment is a stripped down set of 1937 pattern equipment, as we'll see as we move this round. At the front here we have the 2 basic pouches. These are of Canadian manufacture, the webbing belt here. The braces are of Australian manufacture. You can see here the 1-inch section comes up and is stitched into a 2-inch section over the shoulder, which is actually formed from 2 pieces of thinner webbing stitched together. Perhaps have a closer look at this Australian web equipment going forward at some point in the future. So a mix of origins for the components used here. As I say, Australian troops made extensive use of Canadian-made equipment, which had been shipped over during the Second World War. And we have an example of that here in the 2 basic pouches. And on the front of the belt, we have a couple of Mills bombs clipped onto the belt. Around this time, it's very common to see the men of 3RAR carrying grenades clipped onto pockets, web equipment. It's not typical for British and Commonwealth and British Empire forces to do this. Generally, grenades were to be carried in pouches. But, as I say, the men of 3RAR at this time, it's very common to see grenades carried clipped onto the equipment or indeed onto the uniform. So I've illustrated that point here with the grenades clipped onto the front of the belt. Another point to mention here as well is what I've set up on the mannequin here is relatively standard in terms of the kit and so forth that was used at the time. That is to say, this is quite very common to see in photographs at the time. There are actually quite a few photographs which also show very strange mixes of kit and equipment. A lot of US web equipment in use, US entrenching tools, the folding entrenching tool, the M1943 entrenching tool was carried in some instances, all equipment which had been acquired in various ways. There was a lot of US equipment being destroyed and just lying around following the bug out, the retreat from obviously the Chinese entering the war, and as a result of that, Australian troops in Korea at the time seem to have made good use of US equipment which came into their hands one way or another. So quite a few photographs showing that. Didn't want to illustrate anything too exotic on the mannequin here, but it is something that's quite interesting to see in photographs of the time, and there are quite a few photographs available on the Australian War Memorial. I highly recommend going and having a look over there to see the wide variety of kit that was in use at the time. That's the front of the mannequin here. We'll start turning this round now and have a look at some of the other details. Looking at the right hand side of the mannequin here, we can see the side profile of the slouch hat, first of all, with the ventilation eyelets up in the crown there. The brim of this is bound. You see it's quite heavily worn, this particular example. And we can just about see the Rising Sun collar badge on the service dress underneath the combat jacket here. If we lift the collar up here, you can see how the hood attaches on. We have a button at the front here, and then it actually buttons onto the epaulette button here underneath the epaulette as well, as you can see there. Epaulette coming down the shoulder there. And then down the arm here, we can see details of the cuff. You can see there, button cuff does have a gusset, and obviously that can be adjusted in. You can see there, little button tab down on the cuff. Looking at the back of the mannequin here, if I tip the hat forward, we can see details of the hood here, which has been folded back out of the way. You do have a draw cord there. This is made of the same sateen material as the combat jacket itself, so it does give some windproofing when it's pulled up. It's very common to see these attached to the jackets used by Australian, British and other Commonwealth personnel in Korea during the Korean War. It was quite a popular element of the design with British and British Commonwealth forces, and for that reason it provides a bit of windproofing to the head. You see detail of the braces for the web equipment coming down here. Where they cross in the back, there is a loop there to keep them together. You can see that distinctive stripe in the webbing, which is seen in Australian web equipment as well as Indian web equipment. And then another element of Canadian web equipment is the water bottle carrier on the back of the belt here. This has been attached to the brace ends in the middle of the back there, as you can see. Quite a common place to carry this when an entrenching tool carrier was not being carried in the middle here. It means the equipment's more balanced, and you have the enamel felt covered water bottle in that Canadian made carrier there. And as I say, this is a very common thing to see at the time, the water bottle carried in the middle of the back of the belt here. And finally, moving to look at the left-hand side of the mannequin here, if I lift the sleeve out of the way, you can see here we have the bayonet round on the belt here. This, of course, is the bayonet for the Rifle No. 1 Mark III Star, the short magazine Lee Enfield in the older terminology. And this, of course, was still the standard infantry rifle for Australian forces at the time, and would move directly from the Rifle No. 1 Mark III Star to the self-loading rifle, the L1A1, in the later 1950s. So still carrying the venerable old Rifle No. 1 Mark III Star. We have the full-length 1907 bayonet for that rifle carried here in a bayonet frog, standard 1937 pattern bayonet frog. So I hope you found it interesting looking at this. Again, nice to put this together. It's a nice change on the mannequin. It's nice to have something fresh on the mannequin each month to grace the front room. So quite a good way of doing it. And putting the poll out there obviously gives people the opportunity to choose what we're going to talk about each month. So hopefully it has been interesting looking at this. It's been interesting talking about it. If you have enjoyed this and you'd like to see more from the channel, please do consider subscribing if you haven't already. And whether you're newly subscribing or you've previously subscribed, please do make sure you hit the little bell, the notification button down below. That will of course alert you when I upload future videos. If you really like my uploads and you would like to support the channel, you can. Both Patreon and PayPal are linked down below. And as ever, a massive thank you to everybody who supports the channel using those two methods. It's greatly appreciated, as I always say. If you'd like to vote on this each month, it's the corporal tier over on Patreon, which gives the opportunity to vote on what's going to be covered each month in Mannequin of the Month. If you'd like to follow the channel on social media, where there will of course be photographs of this posted up, Facebook, Instagram and Twitter are all linked down below. And if you'd like to get in touch but you don't really use social media, there is of course an email address down there in the description as well. That's everything for this video. So until next time, bye for now.